It's the Friday Cocktail, presented by Anna Glowinski.
Now, I'm joined on the line by Christine Webb. She's written a book called The Arrogant Ape. And as I believe, it stands to correct the assumption that humans are necessarily the most intelligent animals or life forms on this planet, which is something that, I've dipped into this philosophical question a few times before. So I'm really excited to speak to Christine about this. I especially have this, I don't know where it comes from, probably from having seen my octopus teacher, but I have this really strong belief that octopi are really, really smart. Is that a good assumption? There was an octopus fair near us the other day, and I didn't want to go because I just really feel like they're really clever. How do you feel about that, Christine?
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Great to be here. I think octopuses are an amazing example to start out with because I agree. They are incredibly smart and intelligent. And to your question, I guess it comes down to how we define those words, how we define intelligence. And the reason why octopuses are such a great example is because they have smarts and intelligence that looks quite a lot like human smarts and intelligence, right? They solve problems, they use tools, they're innovative and creative, they communicate in complex ways. And yet, their body plans and brains are so different from humans. They actually have a distributed nervous system, unlike our central nervous system. So instead of having one brain, they actually are said to have 9 brains, one in each arm and then one in their main body. And so it's a perfect example of how similar functions, similar forms of intelligence can arise through completely different anatomical structures over the course of evolution. And I also want to add that I think we can define intelligence in itself in many different ways that don't just have to be tied to a human benchmark. But it's great to start out with the
yeah, and that does lead us nicely because I had my next question was going to be about that. You've specifically said, octopus have an intelligence that humans can recognize as intelligence. So that makes me think that there's another type of intelligence that we're not perhaps respecting or understanding. Could you go into that a little bit more for us?
Sure. A great example here would be mosses. So the indigenous botanist, Robin Wall-Kimmerer, clued me into this fact that we have this one word moss that comprises over 13,000 different species of mosses. So it's a bit of a ridiculous word. But where moss are really intelligent in ways that I think humans have a lot to learn from is that they've been around for hundreds of millions of years compared to humans' meager 200,000. And they've managed to achieve such longevity over evolution in part by creating these thriving interspecies communities. So they cooperate with the soil, with trees and fungi all around them. They provide nutrients. They are these amazing kind of arbiters in the ecological community. And we think of cooperation as being a hallmark of intelligence, right? And humans are known as hyper-cooperators. Other primates cooperate a lot. But what about interspecies cooperation as a marker of intelligence? And mosses are a really great example of that. And look at how many millions of years they've managed to live. So it's one among many examples of a radically different form of intelligence that I think we can learn from.
And I've got a million questions. I'm absolutely bubbling and buzzing to speak to you because this sort of conversation is one that I have at dinner time with my 10-year-old kid, but we don't get too far with it because he's 10 and, I'm a radio presenter. I'm not, I haven't spent years studying this. I've got loads to ask you, but let's go back to just getting to know you a little bit more first. How did you get into this topic and what's your background?
Well, I am a primatologist by training, and I believe I got there in part through a lifelong love of other animals. Many of us, when we're children, have this, and it never left me. And when I went into high school and I read The Origin of the Species for the first time. I started being introduced to evolutionary theory and Darwin's work, and I read The Origin of Species cover to cover, unlike most of the other books that I was assigned in high school. And I was just taken by his explanation that we're all bound by common origins. We are all interdependent on one another, that differences between species are a matter of degree and not kind. It all really resonated with my childhood sense of, wonder and love for the more than human world. And I think you combine those two things together, love for other animals and interest in evolutionary theory. And primatology is kind of a natural endpoint, but I didn't even know that you could be a primatologist. I didn't know that that could be a career. I was fortunate both to have figures like Jane Goodall, right, to look up to, the late, great Jane Goodall, and my mentor, Franz de Waal, who I encountered as an undergrad. He taught a primate social behavior class. And I think it was really when I first took that class that I knew, okay, I want to get paid to spend my days with other primates.
And so where did this interest in primates, where does it take you?
So it took me many different places. I've worked with primates in zoos and in labs. And I've also more recently now only worked with them in sanctuaries and in the wild. So one of my favorite places in the world where I've worked with other primates is in Namibia, in the Namib Desert, with desert chacma baboons, and these chimpanzee bonobo sanctuaries in Zambia and the DRC, respectively, or where my work has been most recently. But prior to that, I also worked, as I said, in in highly restricted captive environments. And that has also taught me a lot about the way that science is done and how I want to do it and how I don't want to do it.
And so still talking specifically about primates, where are we at, just in a very snapshot sort of way, where are we at with our sort of mainstream understanding of primates, how they operate, how similar they are to humans? Because I think that is the reason why humans are so compelled often to study primates. So lots of studies done about, bringing up chimpanzees the same way that you'd bring up a human child and see whether they'd respond the same way. Obviously, we've come a long way since then. Where are we at now? How would you describe that to a general listener?
Sure. So when I began taking courses in primatology, I guess when I was 19 years old, so almost 20 years ago now, there were a number of characteristics that we had long thought were human unique that other primate species were already, exhibiting, and we were learning. Well, they've always been exhibiting it, but were we clued into it? And we were learning about their capacity for tool use, for self-awareness, for complex forms of consciousness and learning. I was really interested in their capacity to empathize with one another and to resolve conflicts after they occur. And the list kind of has gone on and on. All of these characteristics that we long reserved for humans have been observed in other primate species. Culture, language. I would say now the questions are around things like rationality, right? Do they reason in ways similar to humans? And there was actually a study published very recently that showed that they have a particular kind of rational thought process that we once believed was human unique. And I'm drawing on all of these examples to make a broader point, which is that all of the cognitive Rubicons that we thought separated humans from other primates have been shown in other primates. And so my question is more, at what point do we choose to abandon this hypothesis altogether? Because we just kind of continue to switch the goalposts or to move the goalposts and assume that it's a different criteria or a different characteristic. But once again, we were wrong.
And that, that word different, I think, is really interesting because ultimately we're the ones studying them. They're not studying us. Does that make us more intelligent, or is it a different type of intelligence?
Well, having spent a lot of time around them, I would not agree that they're not studying us. I think they're expert anthropologists. They watch our behavior so carefully, in part because they might feel they have to, right, for their own safety. So they can predict our behaviors, our movements. I believe they also can try to understand what we're thinking, what our intentions are. I mean, I've had many experiences with other primates where I feel like I'm the one who's being watched and studied more so than the reverse. And it's not to say that, I mean, okay, we could maybe say another example, which is that chimpanzees aren't out there hosting a radio show, right, and having a conversation about this topic. And chimpanzees aren't sending themselves in rocket ships to the moon, right? So there are obviously a number of things that other primates are not doing that many human primates are doing. But the book that, and the work that I'm interested in, the book that I wrote, is about human exceptionalism, which is different from something like human uniqueness. So I'm not altogether opposed to this notion that humans have unique qualities. I would just offer that most of those qualities, like I said, have either been discovered in other animals or they're absent in many human groups, like people who are in a coma, for instance, or very young children. And we don't necessarily say that they're not human. So I'm always cautious with this notion of human uniqueness. But even if we want to assume that humans are unique, I'm not, against that entirely, that's fine. Then we should say, okay, every species is unique, which they are. And human exceptionalism is different from human uniqueness, because human exceptionalism assumes that what is distinctive about humans is categorically more advanced and intelligent than the distinctive features of other forms of life.
That's really, really interesting about separating, because you used the word arrogance in your title. So can you just carry on with what you were saying, but, just define a bit more using that word arrogance?
Yeah, I remember at one point I looked up the history of the word arrogance, and I think it comes from arrogar, which means to separate out. But the reason why the subtitle is exceptionalism, the myth of human exceptionalism, is because I think there's something about arrogance that's not just about distinguishing oneself, rendering oneself separate and unique, but also superior, right? When we say that's an exceptional student, we're not saying exceptionally bad. Typically we mean better. And there's something about these distinctive qualities that humans have that supposedly make us more evolutionarily advanced, right? Which is counter to evolutionary doesn't proceed in any kind of progressive form, but there's this assumption that the distinctive features that humans hold make them more advanced or somehow more morally worthy than other species. And I think that's the arrogance, and that's the difference.
But you also say that it's a danger. Why do you say that?
Well, I believe that when it comes to the ecological crisis, we often focus on the visible causes, right? Like fossil fuels and overpopulation, biodiversity collapse. Rarely are we questioning the underlying worldview or story that makes all of those exploitative systems possible. And that worldview is human exceptionalism. So I think it's an incredible danger to the way that we relate to the rest of nature. I think it's a danger to ourselves too. There's some beautiful old philosophical work on arrogance and how not only does it prevent us from forming genuine relationships with others, but it also prevents a true understanding of ourselves, because those relationships are the basis of self-understanding. Aristotle called friendships a mirror onto the soul. And if we don't have those kinds of good relationships, healthy relationships with other forms of life, can we really know ourselves?
And if people read your book and they decided to stop being so arrogant, take actual action to change their behavior into a non-arrogant way, what would you see the world looking like? What would you see individual humans acting like? What changes do you think could realistically come into play to maybe make the world a better place or more harmonious with nature?
I think there's so many avenues here. One simple but profound way, I think, comes down to the language that we use, the words we use when we describe other species. We often talk about natural resources and ecosystem services, and we use words like beef and pork instead of cows and pigs. And I still remember the first time an editor crossed out who every time I referred to an individual chimpanzee in one of my studies and replaced it with that. And according to grammar authorities, we use who for people and that for objects. And these terms reinforce the idea that other species are there for humans' instrumental use, and they're just things or property. And so I think we can actually change our language. What if we talked about, instead of natural resources, our lifelines and our codependents, our neighbors, our relatives? There's so many other word choices we can use. And I think those simple shifts can be incredibly powerful. And then beyond that, we can think about, okay, how do we challenge human exceptionalism in our economics, right? Where trees and forests only gain value when they're cut down, or in our legal systems where only humans are subjects of rights, where other species are things or property, or in our food systems and how we consume, or in our rituals and our holiday celebrations. I mean, I'm trying to squeeze in a lot here because I think there's something there for everyone. And it also depends. I tell people to start where they are. If you're a lawyer, if you're an economist, if you're a writer, if you're a teacher, there's so many different ways to challenge this myth in its hold on our institutions and systems.
And we've talked about some of the heavy messaging there, and quite rightly so. I think the way that many people will relate to that is through these stories, these fascinating discoveries that you've made that perhaps connect with the little child that we still have inside us that go like, wow, no way. Could we end the interview with just a few of those from your book that really, you've discovered as you've gone on that you think, that's amazing?
Yeah, I'll come back to these desert chacma baboons and a really life-changing experience I had with one named Bear, where we were in the field and he was a juvenile male baboon at the time, causing a lot of trouble with the field team, often climbing up our legs, trying to kind of steal our GPS systems or backpacks. And one day it got a little bit out of hand and kind of instigated a mobbing event with one of my colleagues where a bunch of other baboons surrounded her and started barking and slapping her legs. And it was terrifying, especially for her, also for me and for the baboons. And the next day where I was with this same troop, I almost didn't even want to be with this troop because it had gotten so out of hand and it felt quite dangerous to be with them again. But I was really following them at a great distance. And at one point, I see Bear in the distance and he's coming straight for me. And I am in a really precarious situation. I can't actually get out of his way because I'm wobbling down a steep, rocky incline and he keeps getting closer and closer. And finally, he gets really close to me and I'm terrified. I'm thinking, okay, he's going to do something and cause another one of these events. And actually, in that moment, he put his hand in between my hiking boots and he looked up and he bared his teeth at me into this awkward, forced grimace. And I remember it so clearly because his teeth were so white and I had never seen baboon teeth that up close before. And as a primatologist, I know that this is a pacifying gesture. This is something baboons do to reconcile with one another after conflicts. And so I believe Bear was making amends for what had happened the day before. He knew what I was feeling, right? A form of empathy. He knew I was afraid. He also knew what I knew. He knew that I knew what had happened the day before. And we call this a theory of mind, the capacity to know what others know. Both of these characteristics, empathy and theory of mind, were qualities I learned in graduate school were unique to humans. And there have been a lot of other experiments and studies on showing these capacities in other primates now. But it was amazing how just in that one-on-one interaction, Bear taught me he was capable of something I didn't know baboons were capable of. And I always say, never underestimate them, because they will surprise you and prove you wrong almost every single time if you are open enough to let them.
Well, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you today. You've been listening to Christine Webb, and she's written a book called The Arrogant Ape. You can find it on Amazon or go check it out on the Talk Radio Europe bookshop. Christine, thank you for joining us today. Goodbye.
Thanks so much. Bye.